"Drag that wretched poor man out of this place." The words cut through the string quartet's melody like a blade through silk. Every head in the grand ballroom turned. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across faces frozen mid-conversation, champagne flutes suspended in the air. The Montecito estate sprawled across 12 acres of California coastline, and tonight it hosted what industry insiders were already calling the wedding of the decade. Tech founders mingled with venture capitalists. Hollywood executives exchanged business cards with real estate moguls. The guest list read like a Forbes compilation, and everyone knew it. At a table near the terrace doors sat a black man in his early 50s. His clothing was simple, almost threadbare. A cotton shirt that had seen too many washes. Slacks that carried no designer label. Shoes that were clean but worn at the heels. He sat with perfect posture, one hand resting on the white linen tablecloth, the other lifting a glass of Bordeaux to his lips. He sipped slowly, deliberately, as though he had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. The host stood 15 feet away, draped in a custom tuxedo that cost more than most people's cars. His face had turned the particular shade of red that comes from equal parts champagne and indignation. He was pointing, his finger trembling slightly, his voice rising to ensure the surrounding tables could hear every syllable. Security was already moving, two men in dark suits threading through the crowd with practiced efficiency. The black man set down his glass. He did not stand. He did not speak. His eyes remained calm, focused on some middle distance, as though he were watching something the rest of them could not see. The first security guard reached him, placed a hand on his shoulder. Still, he did not resist. He simply stood, smoothed the front of his shirt, and allowed himself to be guided toward the exit. The guests watched in silence. Some looked away, suddenly fascinated by their plates. Others leaned toward their companions, whispering behind cupped hands. A few pulled out phones, though whether to record or to pretend they were occupied was unclear. The humiliation was complete, public, designed to reinforce the boundaries of this world. The man walked between the security guards with his head level, his steps measured. He did not hurry. He did not stumble. As he passed the host, he spoke just once, his voice low enough that only those within a few feet could hear. "You should not assume." Then he was gone, escorted through the French doors and into the manicured gardens beyond. The quartet resumed playing. Conversations restarted, though with less enthusiasm than before. The host accepted congratulations from a nearby group, his smile returning, his color normalizing. Crisis averted. Order restored. The evening could continue. But something had shifted. A discomfort lingered in the room, a question unasked. Who exactly had just been removed? And why had he been there in the first place? The tables near the terrace doors were quieter now, their occupants exchanging glances that carried more weight than their earlier pleasantries. One woman, her diamonds catching the light, turned to her husband and asked a question that would prove more prescient than she knew. What if they had made a mistake? Before we continue, ask yourself this. What kind of man accepts humiliation without defending himself? What kind of power operates in complete silence? Subscribe now, because what you're about to learn will change how you see everyone in that room. The story of who this man was did not begin at that wedding. It began 3 decades earlier, in a neighborhood in Oakland that gentrification had not yet discovered. He grew up in a household where money was scarce but expectations were high. His mother worked 2 jobs. His father had disappeared before his 5th birthday. He learned early that survival required observation, that the loudest voice in the room was rarely the most intelligent, and that real power accumulated slowly, in places others were not looking. He excelled in school not because he loved it but because he understood it was the only reliable path forward. Scholarships carried him to UC Berkeley, where he studied economics and computer science at a time when the latter was still considered niche. He graduated with honors and no debt, a combination that placed him in a rare category. His classmates went to Wall Street or Silicon Valley startups. He did neither. Instead, he took a position at a small investment firm in San Francisco that specialized in emerging markets. The pay was modest, but the firm's founder was a man who valued discretion over flash, who built wealth through patience rather than spectacle. The young analyst learned to read balance sheets the way others read novels, to identify patterns in market behavior that others dismissed as noise. He made his first million by 30, not through a single brilliant trade but through a series of careful, incremental decisions that compounded over time. The firm's founder took notice. He began assigning the analyst more complex projects, introducing him to clients who operated at higher altitudes. These were not the venture capitalists who appeared on magazine covers. These were family offices managing generational wealth, sovereign funds from countries most Americans could not locate on a map, individuals whose names appeared nowhere but whose influence shaped industries. The analyst became indispensable, not because he sought the spotlight but because he delivered results without requiring recognition. By his mid-30s, he had begun making his own investments. He identified a logistics company struggling with debt but possessing infrastructure that would prove critical as e-commerce accelerated. He acquired a controlling stake for less than the cost of a modest home. Within 5 years, that company became the backbone of distribution networks for 3 major retailers. He sold his stake for a sum that placed him firmly in the category of the independently wealthy, though he told no one, and his lifestyle changed not at all. He continued working at the firm. The founder, now in his 70s, began transitioning leadership. The analyst was the obvious choice for succession, but he declined. He had no interest in managing people or cultivating clients. He wanted to think, to analyze, to identify opportunities that others missed because they were too busy performing wealth rather than building it. The founder understood. They restructured the relationship. The analyst became an independent contractor, a strategic advisor who worked on projects of his choosing, who received compensation tied to outcomes rather than hours. This arrangement suited him perfectly. He maintained a small apartment in Oakland, the same neighborhood where he had grown up, though the coffee shops now served pour-overs and the corner store had been replaced by an organic market. He drove a 10-year-old sedan. He wore clothes until they required replacement, not because he was frugal but because consumption held no interest for him. His wealth accumulated in accounts he rarely checked, managed by advisors he had vetted thoroughly and then largely ignored. What he did care about was identifying systems that others had written off as failures. He specialized in resurrection, in finding value where conventional wisdom saw only loss. A manufacturing plant in the Central Valley that had been shuttered during the recession. A software company whose product was brilliant but whose marketing was non-existent. A commercial real estate portfolio in Sacramento that everyone assumed was worthless until the state government began expanding its offices. He bought low, improved quietly, and sold high, always to buyers who appreciated what they were getting but never asked too many questions about who was selling. His reputation in certain circles grew, though his name remained largely unknown. He became someone people whispered about at private dinners, a figure whose involvement in a deal signaled hidden value. Investment bankers would mention him to their most sophisticated clients, always with a caveat. He does not take meetings, he does not negotiate terms, and he responds to opportunities on his own timeline. Those who understood this world knew that such constraints indicated not difficulty but power. The difficult ones were those who desperately wanted your attention. The powerful ones made you wait for theirs. In his mid-40s, he encountered another investor who operated in a similar way. This man was also black, also California-based, though his wealth operated at a different magnitude. Where the first man had built his fortune through careful accumulation, this second man had built his through scale. He had founded a technology company in the early days of the internet, taken it public, and then used the proceeds to fund a venture capital firm that had backed some of the most successful startups of the past 2 decades. His net worth was measured in billions, not millions, and his name appeared frequently in business publications, though he rarely granted interviews. They met at a charity event in San Francisco, one of the few public gatherings the first man attended. The conversation was brief, focused on a mutual interest in educational reform. They exchanged contact information, and over the following months, they began a correspondence. Email mostly, occasionally phone calls, never in person unless absolutely necessary. They discovered they shared a philosophy about wealth, that it was a tool, not an identity, and that the most effective deployment of capital happened away from cameras and applause. The billionaire was involved in a project that required the kind of surgical precision the first man specialized in. A series of properties in Los Angeles that could be assembled into a development, but only if acquired without triggering speculation. The first man agreed to lead the acquisition, working through shell companies and intermediaries, never appearing on any documentation. The project took 3 years. When complete, it generated returns that exceeded even the billionaire's projections. More importantly, it established trust. They began collaborating regularly. The billionaire would identify opportunities at the macro level, the first man would execute at the micro level. Neither needed to explain themselves to the other. Neither required validation or credit. They built together in silence, and that silence made them formidable. Over a decade, their joint ventures touched everything from affordable housing developments to clean energy infrastructure, from educational technology to healthcare logistics. The profits were substantial, but more valuable was the partnership itself, the rare experience of working with someone who understood that impact mattered more than attribution. The first man remained largely invisible. He attended no conferences, joined no boards, appeared in no photographs. When business associates asked the billionaire who his partner was on certain deals, the billionaire would smile and say only that he worked with someone who preferred to remain private. This was respected. In the highest echelons of wealth, privacy was understood to be the ultimate luxury, more precious than any yacht or estate. So when the first man received an invitation to a wedding at a Montecito estate, he almost declined. The bride was the daughter of a tech entrepreneur the billionaire had backed early in his career. The groom was the son of a European banking family. The guest list was a who's who of global wealth. The first man had no interest in such spectacles, but the billionaire asked him personally. He would be there, and he wanted to introduce his partner to a few people who might appreciate the kind of work they did together. The first man agreed, though with reluctance. He did not own a tuxedo. He did not see the point in acquiring one for a single event. He dressed in the same clothes he wore to the occasional business dinner, simple and clean, and drove himself to Montecito in his aging sedan. He arrived as the ceremony was concluding, parked among the Bentleys and Teslas, and made his way to the reception. Security at the entrance checked the guest list, found his name, and waved him through without comment. He entered the ballroom, accepted a glass of wine from a passing server, and found a seat at an empty table near the terrace doors. He had planned to wait there until the billionaire arrived, then make his introductions and leave early. He sipped his wine and watched the room, observing the performances of wealth that he had spent his life avoiding. The designer gowns, the conspicuous jewelry, the laughter that was slightly too loud, the conversations that were slightly too animated. Everyone trying to signal their importance to everyone else. An exhausting theater that never seemed to end. He did not notice the host approaching until the man was nearly upon him. He did not recognize the host, did not know that this was the groom's father, a man who had built his fortune in commercial real estate and who believed that wealth conferred the right to control any space he occupied. The host had been drinking, not enough to slur his words but enough to amplify his impulses. He saw a black man in unremarkable clothes sitting alone at his son's wedding reception, and he made an assumption that felt, to him, entirely reasonable. The rest unfolded exactly as it had. The pointed finger, the public accusation, the security guards, the removal. The first man did not explain himself because he had learned long ago that explanations to people who had already decided what they believed were futile. He spoke his single sentence, not as a threat but as an observation, and then he left with dignity intact. Outside, in the garden, the security guards escorted him toward the parking area. They were professional, not rough, but firm. One of them asked if he had crashed the wedding, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than accusation. The first man said nothing. They reached his car, and the guards waited to ensure he drove away. He started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and headed toward the Pacific Coast Highway. He felt no anger, only a familiar exhaustion. This was not the first time someone had looked at him and seen only what they expected to see. It would not be the last. He considered calling the billionaire to explain why he would not be returning, but decided against it. The billionaire would understand. He always did. Back at the wedding, the reception continued. The host had rejoined his circle, accepting congratulations for handling the intrusion with decisiveness. The guests who had witnessed the removal were already folding it into the evening's narrative, a minor disruption that would make the event more memorable. The bride and groom were circulating, thanking attendees, posing for photographs. The quartet played on. Then the billionaire arrived. He entered through the main doors, immediately recognizable to half the room. Conversations paused as people noted his presence. The host moved to greet him, hand extended, smile wide. The billionaire shook his hand, exchanged pleasantries, and then asked a simple question. Had his business partner arrived yet? The host's expression shifted slightly. Which partner? The billionaire described him, a black man in his early 50s, simple clothes, probably sitting quietly somewhere. The host's face went pale. He began to stammer, to explain, to justify. The billionaire listened without interrupting, his expression unchanged. When the host finished, the billionaire asked another question. Where was this man now? The host did not know. He had been escorted out. The billionaire nodded slowly, pulled out his phone, and made a call. It went to voicemail. He left a brief message, apologizing for the confusion and asking his partner to return. Then he looked at the host and said something that everyone within earshot would remember. The man you removed is worth more than everyone in this room combined, and he earned every dollar of it. The silence that followed was absolute. The billionaire did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words carried a weight that volume could never achieve. He turned to leave, then paused and added one more thing. You built your fortune on leverage and luck. He built his on intelligence and patience. You should learn the difference. He walked out. The host stood frozen, his face now drained of color. The guests nearest to him stepped back slightly, as though proximity might associate them with his mistake. Someone pulled out a phone and began typing rapidly. Within minutes, the story was spreading through text messages and private group chats. Within an hour, it would reach social media, stripped of names but heavy with implication. A black man removed from an elite wedding. A billionaire's rebuke. The humiliation of the powerful by the invisible. The host tried to recover. He sent security to find the man who had been removed, to bring him back, to apologize. But the car was already miles away, heading north on the highway, and the man inside had no intention of returning. The host then tried to reach the billionaire, calling his cell phone repeatedly, leaving voicings that grew increasingly desperate. The billionaire did not answer. The wedding continued, but its atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The joy had curdled into discomfort. Guests began leaving earlier than planned, citing early flights and prior commitments. The bride, who had known nothing of the incident until it had already metastasized, wept in a bathroom while her bridesmaids tried to comfort her. The groom confronted his father in a side room, his voice carrying through the door despite his efforts to keep the argument private. By midnight, the ballroom was half empty. By 1, the band was packing up. By 2, only the cleaning staff remained, clearing plates and glasses from tables that looked less like celebration and more like abandonment. The following morning, the first man woke in his Oakland apartment to 17 missed calls. He listened to the voicemails over coffee. The billionaire apologizing. The host begging for a chance to make it right. A reporter from a business publication asking for comment on an incident at a Montecito wedding. He deleted all of them and went for a walk through his neighborhood. He felt no satisfaction. The host's humiliation brought him no pleasure. He had not wanted to be vindicated, had not needed the billionaire to defend him. He would have preferred to simply disappear, to let the incident fade into the background noise of social mistakes that happened at every gathering. But he understood that the billionaire's response had not been about defending him personally. It had been about drawing a line, about making clear that dignity was not negotiable and assumptions carried consequences. Over the following days, the story circulated through the networks where such stories traveled. No mainstream media outlet covered it. There were no names, no photographs, no official statements. But in the group chats of venture capitalists, in the private dining rooms where family offices made decisions, in the conference calls where real estate moguls discussed deals, the story was told and retold. Details shifted slightly with each telling, but the core remained the same. A powerful man had mistaken quiet for weak. A billionaire had corrected him publicly. The man who had been wronged had simply walked away. The first man received calls from people he had not spoken to in years, associates reaching out to express support or curiosity. He kept these conversations brief, offering no details, confirming nothing. He returned to his work, analyzing a commercial property portfolio in Fresno, reviewing financials for a logistics company in Portland. The rhythm of his life resumed its usual pattern. The host, meanwhile, faced consequences that accumulated quietly but devastatingly. Business partners began to distance themselves. A major development deal he had been negotiating stalled, then collapsed entirely, though the official reason given was financing issues. Invitations to exclusive events stopped arriving. His calls went unreturned. Within 6 months, his commercial real estate firm had lost 3 of its largest clients. Within a year, he was forced to sell assets to cover debts. The decline was not dramatic enough to make headlines, but it was thorough enough to matter. His son's marriage lasted 18 months. The bride later told friends that the wedding had been cursed from the start, that she could never forget the way her father-in-law had treated someone with such casual cruelty, and that it had colored everything that followed. The divorce was quiet, expensive, and final. The billionaire never spoke to the host again. When asked about the incident in interviews, which happened rarely, he would say only that he valued integrity over performance, and that he chose his associates accordingly. This became a signal in certain circles. To be associated with the billionaire was to be vetted not just financially but morally. His standards became legendary, and those who met them found opportunities that others could not access. The first man continued his work, his anonymity intact. The incident at the wedding became a story others told about him, but never to him. He remained the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that guided deals to completion, the strategic mind that others relied on but rarely met. His wealth continued to grow, though he lived no differently. He donated substantial amounts to educational programs in Oakland, always anonymously, always through intermediaries. Years later, a young analyst at an investment firm in San Francisco would hear the story third-hand. A black man removed from a wedding. A billionaire's defense. A host's downfall. The analyst would ask his mentor, an older man who had worked in finance for decades, if the story was true. The mentor would nod and say it was, more or less, though the details had probably shifted over time. The analyst would then ask the obvious question, who was the man who got thrown out? The mentor would smile and explain that this was the wrong question. The right question was, what kind of person builds power so quietly that even their humiliation cannot diminish it? What kind of person walks away from vindication because they never needed it in the first place? The analyst would consider this, and the mentor would add one final thought. In this world, the loudest people are rarely the most powerful. The ones who perform wealth are usually the ones who are most afraid of losing it. But the ones who build it in silence, who accumulate it through patience and intelligence, who deploy it without needing recognition, those are the ones who change everything while the rest of us are busy watching the show. The wedding in Montecito became a cautionary tale. Not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. That assumptions about worth based on appearance are not just morally wrong but strategically foolish. That dignity under humiliation is a form of power that wealth cannot purchase. That the most dangerous people to underestimate are the ones who have nothing to prove. The host never recovered his reputation. He spent the rest of his career explaining the incident to anyone who would listen, insisting it had been a misunderstanding, that he had made an honest mistake, that he had been misled by circumstance. No one believed him. Mistakes of that magnitude do not come from confusion. They come from conviction. He had been convinced that he could judge a man's worth by his clothing, his posture, his color. He had been convinced that his space belonged only to people who looked like they belonged. He had been convinced that power announced itself with volume and decoration. He had been wrong about all of it, and the market corrected him the way markets always do, ruthlessly, efficiently, completely. The billionaire, when asked in a rare long-form interview about the philosophy that guided his investments, told a story without names. He described a partner he had worked with for over a decade, someone who had helped him build some of his most successful ventures, someone whose intelligence exceeded his own in specific domains. He explained that this partner avoided publicity not out of humility but out of strategy, that invisibility allowed him to operate where others could not, that his greatest asset was that most people had never heard of him. The interviewer asked why this partner chose to remain anonymous. The billionaire's answer was simple. Because he understood that recognition was a liability, not an asset. Because he knew that the moment you become visible, you become targetable. Because he had learned early that the most valuable position in any room was the one no one noticed until it mattered. The first man read this interview on his phone while waiting for a meeting in Sacramento. He had never discussed the wedding incident with the billionaire, and the billionaire had never mentioned it again after that night. They had simply continued their work, launching new projects, identifying new opportunities, building infrastructure that would outlast both of them. The interview was the closest either of them had come to acknowledging what had happened, and even then, it was oblique, careful, designed to teach without revealing. He put his phone away and entered the meeting. It concerned a housing development that could provide affordable units in a city desperate for them, but the financing structure was complex and the political obstacles were substantial. He spent 3 hours working through the details with city officials and community organizers, asking questions that illuminated problems others had missed, suggesting solutions that others had not considered. When the meeting ended, the lead city official shook his hand and said they had been trying to solve this problem for 5 years, and in 3 hours he had shown them a path forward. He drove back to Oakland as the sun set over the bay. His phone contained 7 new voicemails, all related to potential investments. He would listen to them tomorrow. Tonight, he wanted to walk through his neighborhood, maybe stop at the corner where the old store used to be, where he had bought candy as a child with coins scrounged from couch cushions. The organic market that replaced it stayed open late. He bought a few things and walked home, carrying groceries in a worn canvas bag. Upstairs, in his modest apartment, he made dinner and ate alone. No television, no music, just the sound of the city outside his window. He thought about the wedding sometimes, but not with anger. It had simply confirmed what he already knew, that the world was full of people who confused appearance with reality, who mistook silence for absence, who believed that power had to announce itself to exist. They were wrong, but their wrongness did not require his correction. The market would handle that the way it always did. His job was simpler, to identify value where others saw none, to build systems that served people rather than just enriching investors, to deploy capital with precision and withdraw before the applause began. This was the work that mattered. This was the legacy that would outlast any wedding, any humiliation, any defense. And as he finished his dinner and washed his single plate in the sink, he considered a question that might seem obvious but was worth asking anyway. What would the world look like if power measured itself by impact rather than visibility? If respect was given based on what people built rather than how loudly they announced it? If dignity was recognized as the only currency that inflation could never devalue? He did not have an answer, but he knew this. The question itself was more valuable than any fortune, and the ones who lived it rather than just asking it were the ones who changed everything without ever needing credit for the change. Outside, the city continued its restless rhythm. Somewhere in Montecito, a ballroom sat empty, its chandeliers dark, its tables cleared, its legacy reduced to a story people told about the danger of assumptions. And somewhere on the Pacific Coast Highway, miles of beautiful coastlines stretched into darkness, indifferent to wealth, indifferent to status, indifferent to everything except the truth that the ocean had always known, that the deepest waters make the least noise, and the most powerful forces move in silence.